So, guys, today I have with me Dr. Bhat Arman and Dr. Jawad Hashmi. They have announced a course in which they are going to discuss the historical problems related to the Bible and the Quran. This course is called The Bible and the Quran Comparing Their Historical Problems. So, I would welcome both of you gentlemen here, and I would like you to just briefly introduce the course. And afterwards, I'll ask a few important questions about this course that our audience gets an idea like what you guys are going to be teaching us about. So, uh, Dr. Aman, you can start, and then
Yeah,
Dr.
sure. So, the course is set up to consider the similar problems that you have in the New Testament and the Quran, historical problems. Like, do you know what the authors really originally wrote? So, I'll lecture about that on the New Testament, and Javad will lecture about it on the Quran. And then, are there contradictions? If there are contradictions, what do you do about that in the New Testament and the Quran? How do you know really what Jesus said and did? How do you know what Muhammad really said and did? And so we'll each give a lecture, and then we'll talk about it between ourselves, and it'll be a way of seeing kind of, what's similar and different in these historical issues, these key historical issues for understanding the Islamic and Christian scriptures.
Dr. Hashmi, can you please?
Yeah, please just call me Javad. Very nice to meet you. The impetus behind this course was I think there's a lot of interest when it comes to Islamic origins. That's become a really hot topic recently. But the public is really kind of getting a warped impression of what that is because it's kind of modulated through kind of Islamic apologetics on the one side and the kind of anti-Islam polemics on the other. And so the idea was, well, why don't we teach this, just the kind of course that you would get at a Harvard or Yale or Chicago. Why don't we put it out to the public and do it in a comparative way? And then I thought, who better to do that with than the great Bart Ehrman? I never thought it would happen, but here we are.
Yeah, I know you guys are going to have a great. You're going to teach us great things in this course. And Dr. Arman, my question to you is like, there are four gospels in the New Testament, and we know, and as you have told countless times in your books, that these gospels claim that they are eyewitness testimonies, but they are not. So, if they're not eyewitness testimonies, how trustable are they about the life of Jesus? Can we like say that this is what Jesus was teaching that is mentioned in the gospels, or like he was entirely different, or how similar he was,
Yeah.
like to the story in the gospels?
Yeah, well, it's really the key question. The Gospels are written some decades after Jesus. The earliest Gospel is probably Mark, and it's probably about 40 years after Jesus died. And the authors didn't know Jesus. They're writing in a different language from Jesus. They're living in a different part of the world from Jesus. And so this is one of the major tasks of historical scholarship and on the New Testament, and has been one of the major tasks since the 1770s. And so it's been around a long time. What most historians think is that the Gospels do contain historical material about what Jesus said and did, but they also present this material with religious views attached. And so they're painting Jesus in particular ways in order to advance the author's views of Jesus. And so the task of the historian is to try to understand what historically happened based on these sources, what actually happened in the life of Jesus, but also to understand what the stories are trying to convey about the religious understandings of Jesus. Because both things are important, both knowing what happened in the past, but also having religious reflections on the significance of the past. And so that's what historians do. And most historians are confident that we can say a lot of things about the historical Jesus, and we can say a lot of things about the theological views of each of these different accounts.
And Dr. Hashmi, I first want to congratulate you that you are taking up this thing for the first time, because rarely Muslim scholars want to discuss Quran in the same light as New Testament or the Bible is discussed. And this is commendable work that you are doing, and this is very courageous as well, because sometimes people do get a lot of criticism because of this. So, as we talked about the Gospels, that they are not eyewitness testimonies, we have the Quran, and Quran is the most important text of Islam. But there are other texts that are supplementary texts like the Sira corpus and the Hadith corpus. They are there. And, you know, the gospel is just 40 years later Jesus, and it's, as we see that it's like it has its own problems. But the Hadith corpus and the Sira corpus that tells us about how Quran was revealed, and the Hadith corpus tells us that like how the Quran was compiled, that comes way later, a couple of centuries later at least. So how do we reconcile that, the story about Quran, that how it came to be, how it was revealed, and how it was later compiled, and the quotation marks and the verse numbers and everything? How can we trust that this corpus that was maybe compiled 200 years later is telling us something that is true about the Quran?
So that's a great question, and I would say historical critical scholarship. We historians want sources that are contemporaneous to the events that they describe, or as close as possible to them. And you're right that the traditional Islamic sources, as far as the Hadith and the Sirah is concerned, the extant sources are from the 9th century, or the 3rd century, as we say, 3rd century in the Islamic calendar, which is quite far removed from the life of the Prophet Muhammad. So one trend in historical scholarship, which can be called the kind of the radical revisionist trend, has been to discount these sources completely, kind of throw them in the garbage can, and look at what we can find from physical evidence, or material evidence, like epigraphic, which is like carvings on stone, that kind of thing, material evidence, and see what those sources tell us. I would say that the trend is now going in a, now I think the trend is towards, okay, we know that the literary sources are late, but they're not completely worthless either. And so the question is, how do we approach those literary sources? And that's kind of what the course is going to be about.
Okay. So, Dr. Aman, I have another question for you. Do you think in all of the New Testament, is there a passage that you think would give us the most accurate historical reality about Christ? Do you think there is one that we can say is that much trustable or that much accurate?
I think there are probably I think there are a lot of passages that are historically accurate that encapsulate what Jesus' message and mission were. One that I especially like is a passage that's found in the Gospel of Matthew that I'm confident actually was spoken by Jesus. I have historical reasons for thinking that I don't need to get into, but this is one passage I'm pretty sure Jesus actually said. It's a passage where Jesus describes the day of judgment, when the king and judge will be sitting on a throne, and the nations of earth will be gathered in front of him. And to his right hand are the sheep, and their left hand are the goats. And he tells the people who are the sheep, these are from all the nations of the earth. He says, come into the blessed kingdom of my Father, because I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. You helped me when I was in need. And so come into my Father's kingdom to have eternal life. And these sheep, humans, they say, Lord, we've never even seen you. What? What do you mean? We've fed you and given you to drink. We don't even know you. And he says, well, as much as you've done it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you've done it to me. Then he turns to the goats, probably a much bigger number, and he says, depart to your eternal punishment. You will be annihilated in flames, because I was hungry and you didn't give me anything to eat. I was thirsty, you didn't give me anything to drink. Naked, you didn't clothe me. And, since you didn't take care of me in need, go off for eternal punishment. And they say, but Lord, we never saw you hungry or thirsty or naked. And he says, inasmuch as you didn't do one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you didn't do it to me. And so they could go off to destruction. I think this is absolutely Jesus' view. He thought that there was a judgment day coming, and people, it didn't matter what you believed. It didn't matter what you thought about Jesus. It didn't matter about faith. It mattered how you treated people. And if you treated people in need well and took care of them, then you're on God's side and he'll reward you. If not, it's off to the flames.
Okay, so this means like Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, as you mentioned many times earlier as well. So, Dr. Hashmi, I would also like you to ask, like, is there a bit of Quran that we can say is like that gives us a real historical insight into the maybe life of prophet or the origin of Islam. Like, is there a is there a surah or verses that do explain this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the majority opinion amongst historians right now is that the Quran seems to go back to the historical Muhammad. However, that's unlike the Hadith and the Sirah, as we talked about. However, the Quran is not like the Gospels. It doesn't narrate the life story of the Prophet Muhammad. It's more like, I would say, probably like the saying, the Q source, which conveniently it starts with the same letter Q. And so as far as information about the prophet's life story, it's actually somewhat of a problematic source to go to. You can get a lot about what his preaching and theological ideas were from the text, and that can be helpful in reconstructing the historical Muhammad, but it's a limited source. Now, for example, one thing that most critical historians have come to now is very similar to what Bart said about the historical Jesus. I would say most critical historians are leaning now towards the idea that the prophet Muhammad was also an apocalyptic prophet, in that sense that the end is coming and is near, which is very different than how traditional Muslims understand it. So the Quran is a valuable source, but it's a difficult source, and so that's really the question: how do you read it, and what kind of information can you glean from it that can tell you about the historical Muhammad? For example, the name of Muhammad is barely mentioned; it's only a handful of times, whereas Jesus is mentioned much more. It's interested in the past prophets as opposed to the life of the prophet himself. So, but we'll talk about this more in the course.
Okay, so the final question to Dr. Arman is, Dr. Arman, many a times people who study Christianity or the scriptures of Christianity, especially the New Testament, they say that maybe the most important figure in all of New Testament, equally important to Jesus, and maybe some people say that he's even more important than Jesus. That's Paul, because it's Paul written all over. Some people say that, people have this opinion that is Paul written all over the New Testament, and even the Gospels were actually inspired by what Paul's views were. So, what do you think? Like, what can we know about Paul, and what can we say? Like, this is a very long question, but what can we say? Like, what was his true influence on the lives of uh, people who are Christian today?
Yeah, I mean, I myself think that next to Jesus, Paul's probably the most important figure in Christianity in its entire history. I think he is hugely important. And just in the New Testament, there are 27 books in the New Testament. 13 of them claim to be written by Paul, and one is written about him, the book of Acts, and another was put into the New Testament because people thought he wrote it, even though he didn't. And so more than half the New Testament books are connected with Paul directly, and many others indirectly. So it's the good question. What was his actual historical impact? My view is different from what a lot of people kind of just generally assume. I think a lot of people think Paul's important because he's the one who came up with the idea that Jesus' death and resurrection would bring salvation. I think that's completely wrong, because Paul was persecuting Christians for having that message before he converted. And so that message was around. The significance for Paul historically, in my view, is that Paul was the one who realized that believing in Jesus as the Jewish Messiah did not require a person to be Jewish, so that Gentiles could worship Jesus and could be saved by Jesus' death and resurrection without them having to start following the Jewish law. So men didn't have to be circumcised. Men and women didn't have to keep kosher. They didn't have to observe the Sabbath. They didn't have to become Jews. And by stressing that, Paul opened up the possibility that this could become a worldwide religion rather than just a sect within Judaism, so that it isn't just like a kind of Judaism, it's its own thing. And that opened up the way for it to take over the Western world, which it did after several centuries. So I think that was his major contribution. I think it really was a major contribution, so that it does make him extremely important for understanding Christianity.
Hmm. So, okay, Dr. Hashmi, one final question for you, and that is also on the same lines. Do you think that is there a Paul-like figure in Islam too that had a major influence on the lives of Muslims today? Because 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, and definitely there is someone who might have told Prophet Muhammad's story you know, in the same light or in the same way as Jesus' story was told by Paul, and it inspired so many people. So do you think is there someone like that?
So it's a tough question. When you ask analogies from one religion to another, it's not going to be exactly alike. But what I would say is that there's definitely, believers have this idea that the religion comes all at one point. The Big Bang theory of religion, as I call it, it comes from the heavens and it's at the point of origin and it hasn't changed ever since. But as historians of religion, we realize no, that's not really the case. Religions change and evolve over time, and the tradition develops, and that's definitely the case when it comes to Islam. And I do think, and this is probably a topic that we should explore more, historians, is I do think that the course of Islam definitely could have gone in many different directions, and we should probably pay attention to the first caliphs. I think their decisions definitely changed the course, and maybe that is like a Paul in that sense. So could Caliph Abu Bakr or Umar be the Paul of Islam? And it's a weak analogy, but I think that's something definitely worth exploring. And since this is the last question, I did want to say that uh, I I noticed that you're in a mask and have to be anonymous. And as a you know I am a believing Muslim. I'm ethnically Pakistani. I've spent time in Pakistan. I do want to. I think it's sad, and I apologize that that's the state of affairs where you have to
No, you don't have to
hide in
apologize.
anonymity.
You know, yeah. But last and final question for you, and I think I'm going just 1 minute over. What do you think a Christian or a Muslim or a non-believer? I am a non-believer myself, and a lot of my followers are non-believers. Would get from your course, briefly from both of you.
Well, I'll just say briefly that, we will be approaching the New Testament and the Quran from a perspective that's very different from what people would get in the religious communities. Speaking for Christianity, this is not the sort of thing you would normally hear in churches, but it's information that scholars who are diligently digging to try and understand the truth, the historical truth about Christianity, have developed. And many of these scholars are Christians themselves, but it's historical information that's valuable for anybody who believes in this. And it's also valuable for people who don't believe, people of other faiths or people who don't believe at all, because these two religions, these are the two biggest religions in the world. Half the world's population is either Muslim or Christian. And to understand the historical truth about these religions is valuable for everybody, I think.
Dr. Hashmi, please.
Yeah, from my side, I hope that whoever takes this course, whether you're a believer or a non-believer, you leave with a slightly more or maybe much more sophisticated view of the topics. I think the discourse online is very polarized between, like I said, Islamic apologetics on the one side and anti-Islam polemics on the other. I think I'm hoping that this course will kind of push everybody toward the middle, maybe, and a place where people can have conversations and critical self-reflection as opposed to attacking each other back and forth. But that's my goal.
Okay, so thank you to both of you, and I would like the audience to click the link in the description of this video. It's going to take to you the course's website, and you can buy this course, and you can learn a lot from here. I am myself. I'm going to learn a lot from this course, and I'm going to look into it. So I would thank both of you, and it's commendable work that you are doing, and I think this is going to be something that is going to compare both the religions in a historical light rather than the polemic light, because polemics get very heated and they just take you into some confrontational type of thing. That's I'm really thankful, and really glad I talked to both of you.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having us.
Okay,
Thank you
thanks.
so much. Very nice meeting you.
Me too.